in marketing when they say like, when everyone else is zigging, you should zag. So it has a little bit of that, like it'll capture people's attention. You're not 100% against empathy. I mean, you're an empathic guy, but I'd love to talk about empathy and how it kind of relates to pleasure and relates to pain.
Sure. I mean, my friends have made fun of me that I wrote my last two books could be called Against Empathy and In Favor of Suffering. And
Yeah.
I think I'm not against empathy in two senses. First thing, some people use the term empathy very broadly to mean kindness and compassion and love. And I'm not against that. That's horrible. And in fact, the subtitle of my book, just to make it very clear that people who just read the cover, is The Case for Rational Compassion. And I'm also not against empathy in the sense of that I'm interested in putting yourself in another person's shoes, feeling what they feel. In general, it's actually, for instance, it's a great source of pleasure. One of the joys of having a kid, for instance, is to be able to take things you've experienced 1,000 times before, like fireworks or a hot fudge sundae or a Hitchcock movie, and experience them anew each time. One of the joys of fiction, movies, TV, books, is empathic connection to fictional characters. So empathy could be a great source of pleasure. The argument I make in my book is that it's an unreliable moral guide, that if you let your empathy guide you to do the right thing, it'll guide you to help people who look like you, who are close to you, who are friends with you, who are non-threatening. And our empathic preferences are very tied to sort of racial preferences and sexist preferences. And to be really good people, often we have to say, well, empathy is pulling me this way, but I should step back and use my rationality and my caring to act.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been a couple of times where empathy has come up on guests that I've interviewed, and one of them being Stephen Porges, who talks about, he really warned against empathy as well, in terms of his concern was if you are overly empathic, you start to activate areas in your brain that are associated with pain. And it would sort of be like, if you're empathic with someone that's grieving, all of a sudden you start grieving so much, the other person has to take care of you, right? That there's a little bit of a distance or perspective that's needed in order to be compassionate. And then the other part of it, when you use the word compassion, which is slightly, I think that you need to have some degree of empathy to be compassionate. You need to be able to understand someone and empathize emotionally and maybe cognitively with their pain, but not be consumed by it. And certainly as a therapist, you're kind of always walking that line.
I think that's right. And my empathy book is a long chapter on therapy and looking at exactly these issues. And you're right. You need, as a therapist, what we call cognitive empathy. You have to understand what's going on. And you may have had to experience it at some point. If I'm seeing somebody because I'm very lonely, it would be odd for me to get help from somebody who had never experienced loneliness. They just couldn't understand it. But I really agree with the first point that you made, which is that, if I'm seeing my therapist and I'm very anxious and upset and I'm crying and I'm overwhelmed, I don't want her to start crying and get anxious and upset, then I have, then all of a sudden, we have two problems and not one. I want her to give me that therapist look and say, so how does that make you feel? I mean, I want her to understand what's going on with me, to care about me, or to want to make me better. But if I'm anxious, the response I want is calmness. If I'm miserable, I don't want misery jumping back at me. And putting aside what the client wants, there's a therapist, him or herself, which is, a lot of therapists will burn out very quickly if they feel too empathic. And same with other professions like EMTs or pediatric doctors. And if you feel the pain of other people too intensely, your job becomes a misery.
Yeah, it's sort of people are terming it, instead of compassion fatigue, it really should be termed empathy fatigue.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think sometimes as a therapist, it's more like a dial that you need to be able to turn. So sometimes I need to turn up my empathy because I'm not relating with the client enough.